No pressure.
Okay, we're live.
So,
Zoom's up. We're live.
I remember when Act 127 passed my first term, that originally from the Senate came out a 5-year rolling average to smooth in the new weights, the effects of the new weights.
Wow.
So I could support Tammy Colby's approach because I do see rationale. I like the segmentation of the ELL and the disabilities, but I completely concur that another shock on top of other shocks might be less than advised. So I wonder if there's a similar approach where if we move forward with a foundation formula using the existing weights, knowing that we would have a rolling average with the new weights as contemplated, whatever timeline that looks like, just so that like soften the blow and reduce more expect.
So can I respond to that? So with Act 127 and the rolling in of the weight, we were keeping the same type of formula and same
Yes.
way of distributing tax capacity. And so we are radically changing from a tax capacity formula to a foundation formula, which is a radically different kind of formula. The weights mean completely different things. They're both based on cost factors, but in the tax capacity formula, what it does is give districts extra taxing capacity so that they can either spend more without raising their taxes or spend less and lower their taxes. So it's taxing capacity versus actual money to spend. They're not rolling in from one to the next, doesn't work in the same way. So I think the concept with the H 454 is that you have a new formula and new school district at the same time. And so that there's not a way to transition from one to the other with a sort of smooth, but I've been talking with Julia about some transition.
Usually it is working on numbers.
Yeah.
It's also apples and oranges. I mean, just in summation, it's two totally different systems. So we don't know, and I don't think it's clear to us what the outcomes are going to be to various regions of the state. So
I just don't disagree. I don't agree with that. I mean, you're talking about totally increasing the category of poverty. You're talking about eliminating middle school weighting. You're talking about eliminating secondary school weighting. That's a totally different proportional construct than
that's
what districts have adjusted to today.
agreed.
So Joint Fiscal is looking at it. I don't know if it's Julia or a combination thereof, but
Or just to close that, and one thing I just really want to see side by sides because my districts were really affected by that pupil waste. They need to know clearly how this trend.
we do that. I don't know if you have, we used to have Brad James, but when we did the weighting, there were numerous printouts, district by district, of the impact of the new weights. And they shook out a little differently, but they were pretty accurate. We at least knew who the big winners and big losers.
Can we not use those terms, please?
What?
It's not.
Well, some people, and financially, they saw themselves as they lost taxing capacity, their taxes went up. And a couple of schools gained a lot of taxing capacity because they were carrying a lot of burden and hadn't been getting help with it. So I think we need, it's just something to be cognizant of is the impact on individual schools, who's going to be impacted and what impacts have they had to absorb. Half the problem with the weighting was the 10% cap that the House put on. I understand why they did it, because they wanted to get the money out the door to the schools that had been carrying the burden. But it caused a lot of confusion. It took us 3 months to straighten it out before we could start dealing with the 18% tax increase that was hitting in the same year. I'm hoping not to repeat that. So I'm hoping
Brought LEDs for the cemetery.
we bought them. Okay.
Anyone else in the room want jelly beans? Cause I have little cups.
Jelly beans.
You know,
You want
that's
some, Julia?
my
I
daughter
think
will
it's-
talk.
Pick your
Yes. And she, actually, you went right on my list, yeah. And looked on Jelly Bellies, because that's my kind of like, in the afternoon, if I'm stressed out, I'm just starting to Jelly Bellies. So she'll have like a little bag for me that you actually delivered with it, and she, my daughter took Zoe and her boys into the lift. So they got to go to the candy store and they came with the bag. They're talking about, it is, especially.
Yes.
Yeah.
Kids on the way, oh, yes.
Yeah.
Here, I'm leaving these 2 little cups for
Oh,
you.
thank
too.
you.
You know, my mom, I don't want everybody to stick their hands in that.
Right, of course. Are you ready for us?
Yes, okay,
Okay.
so we just straightened out disasters. Undeclared or declared. And we're ready to start. And I said, before you came in, we're hoping this is just the start of the discussion. So that we know what the administration's concerns are as we work our way through this. I don't know that we will always agree or disagree. But I think it's good as we work through that everybody is involved, and we pretty well with the House and the Senate. We have this video conference system, and we usually manage to hammer things out, but I'd rather start earlier than June 15th. And make sure that it's, as much as possible, we're all on the same page. So the floor is yours. We have bills, it's come from them, doctors. And we are starting our work on it. We've just been doing walkthroughs this week.
Good afternoon. For the record, I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education. Jill Briggs Campbell, Deputy Secretary of Education. And thank you for inviting us to join the conversation. We agree that it's helpful and important that we're coordinated at the front end as you're looking at the bill and contemplating refinements. For today's presentation, we put together some high-level considerations. We have not yet had the opportunity to coordinate with JFO to do the deeper analysis, although we are scheduling time to do that. Upon that time, we would like to come back and provide further analysis, being able to be more specific with the recommendations that we bring forward. For today, I wanted to, just based on our initial review, identify areas of consensus. I think we're starting in a good place and that there are some core principles and objectives that are consistent. And there's some details that are different that we really need to iron out. But we're at least starting, I believe, with a shared understanding of what will be required for a transformation, and specifically that being a multi-pronged approach, looking at 3 policy levers around funding, governance, and quality. I'd like to take the opportunity to make some clarifications and corrections regarding the governor's proposal. We know since it was introduced in January, there's a lot of different conversations, and so it's helpful to come back around, make sure to clarify intent so that we're operating all from that shared understanding to build upon. We'd like to highlight some areas we need to explore further, which we think may be reflective of differences in assumptions and objectives between the original bill and the amended bill. This will require us to do a deeper dive, but I do want to highlight that these are areas we will be looking at. And then really would like for us, as I stated at the beginning, to be collaborative in this process. So want to share a proposed approach and some considerations for a rubric as we think about, really aligning our efforts to ensure those shared goals. So we're starting, as I said, from an area of really shared consensus on key and really critical components of the education transformation plan. There is a consensus around the intent to move to an evidence-based foundation formula that is supportive of high quality education and equity. The timeline to get there is a little different, but we are all operating under that future state assumption. We have alignment around having a student focus and student-based funding amount to make sure that those additional dollars are following those students with additional needs. We are all very focused on connecting these recommendations to analysis of our data and research. There's a little bit of a different analysis that we need to bridge, and so we'll need to come back and really exploring those differences and potential considerations accordingly. There seems to be a consensus to move towards larger districts with the intent to achieve scale, increase student opportunities, and promote equity. There's a recognition that the foundation funding formula is interconnected with governance, and when we're talking about governance in this context specific to district size, and that's an important, I think, foundational element to this work. There's a clear focus on ensuring high education quality and identifying opportunities to standardize in key areas, including statewide graduation requirements and class size, statewide calendar. Class sizes actually vary in both proposals, but again, I think the guiding principles underpinning this are consistent. There's an understanding that we need to define those schools that are small by necessity. We're not looking at a cookie cutter approach where everything's going to look exactly the same across our state. And we need to recognize that there's that variability and be really clear around where schools may be small by necessity. I'll talk a little bit about when we talk about small by necessity, it's not only around the rurality, there's other conditions that we're bringing into that, which feed into our timeline that looks a little different. And I think we all understand that this work is really represents fundamental changes to our system and will require a multi-year transition. Both the original bill and what was approved by the House do have a bridge year to a bridge component to account for current spending, knowing that we'll need that stabilization effort before we move to the foundation formula. The timeline varies considerably between the original bill and the House bill. So I want to take an opportunity just to clarify some key components of the governor's proposal. So the proposal put forward does not equate weights and tax capacity. And we understand that those are two different things. What we were looking at is comparing overall spending per pupil and using that as a point of reference, and also to be able to compare that back to research and best practices. As you know, the General Assembly commissioned the evidence-based study by Pikus and Auden. The Agency of Education worked with APA to adjust that model to fit the Vermont context. Those adjustments have been informed by professional judgment panels in other states. Priorities expressed in Vermont law that included an analysis of unfunded mandates, and based on input from teachers and education leaders from the Listen and Learn Board. We have not run professional judgment panels, and the modified from the House bill does not contemplate that in the initial foundation formula either. But the consultant that we've worked with is a firm that has done the most amount of professional judgment panels across the country, so it does bring that expertise in informing the work. As we look at national comparisons, we've talked a lot about how do we compare Vermont spending to other states, and want to be really clear. Foundation formulas are present in many states, but they're very different in terms of how they're developed and implemented. And so just want to give those assurances that when we're comparing the proposal, we are taking into account differences in terms of base and weights and making sure that those are adjusted. The proposal we put forward is one of the largest base amounts and weight categories when we are analyzing our proposal compared to other states.
Can I ask you a quick clarifying question? That first one does not equate weights and tax capacity. Do you mean does not equate weights to tax capacity. Is that what you're saying, that the two aren't the same?
And there were, I think recently over the last several weeks, just questions around how the weights were derived. I think a concern that they were based on tax capacity weights in Act 127. So just recognizing that those are different because the tax capacity is not built upon an established base. It is a different way to fund the system. So we recognize that that's a different way to fund
Okay,
the
so now
system.
more of a grammar question.
Okay, okay,
Yeah.
yeah, and just
Okay.
yeah, so we understand that those systems are different. When we talked about it in our policy briefs, it was really intended to represent overall spending so that we had a point of comparison. The governor's proposal is a multi-year timeline. It was a 2-year transition for moving to the foundation formula with an understanding that we would have to have a bridge year based on current spending that would have adjustments as defined that would be needed for inflation and other special considerations. The governor's proposal accounts for preschool and career and technical education. We've been really clear in identifying the policy objectives regarding education quality and also comparison to national standards. I think there's been some questions around, the degree to which Vermont compares to other states. I think there's some suggestion that the Vermont educational standards are very different or are more rigorous than other states. I haven't seen the empirical studies around that, but certainly we'll be looking at JFO to understand how that assumption is being put forward. But I think it's important for us to really be clear in articulating our assumptions and pointing to those reference points. The governor's proposal does not set a minimum enrollment for elementary schools. I think this is an area that is there's a lot of misunderstanding. When we developed the foundation formula, we used a student enrollment number of 450 to represent a point of efficiency, not a requirement. I think language in the House bill indicates an intent for all elementary schools to move to a student enrollment of 450 in the future state. That would necessarily require some school closure and consolidation. But our proposal does not require that and has made adjustments for school size, assuming that the first year of the transition to foundation formula, we would carry largely our existing schools, but they would be operated.
Okay, now, I get the second, I think they have the same question. Do your final numbers, if 450 is the efficiency number, are the final numbers calculated on that level?
The numbers, yeah, and I think final meaning the numbers we projected. For funding.
Yeah.
The numbers that we've projected are accounting for our actual school size of the existing school portfolio, meaning the existing number of schools that are currently in Vermont. And within the funding formula brief and also in the bill, we've identified the adjustments by school size, and that goes from 450 all the way down to 50 student enrollment of understanding what those differentials would be. It is more costly to operate a smaller school, and our projections carry some of those costs. Those projections also assume that we are implementing class size and really staffing to enrollment.
Really appreciate your clarification, and I heard you say one thing I want to make sure for those watching on YouTube, because this is a point where it has created a lot of concern in the communities when I talk to people, that what I understand from the House bill, and I did ask Representative Conlon today on this specific point when I caught him, my understanding is it's the 450 minimum is really 7th grade on, but I understand that there's no minimum or target minimum for elementary. Am I mistaken in that? I know the bill just came out and we're still trying to overlay, but I understand there's no large school target for elementaries. That's my understanding from what came over at the House.
We'll go back and
Okay,
correct.
sure.
But I'll make sure that we're clear on that. I think for our point, it's that the number is representative of efficiency. So let's say you're a smaller elementary school, because we know that there's a preference in Vermont and many of our communities to have smaller elementary schools. If your school is relatively small, but you're able to deliver on the educational quality, and be financially viable, we wouldn't expect changes, right? And we would also assume that there would need to be a lot of community engagement in a process to understand what school consolidation should look like and how you would share services. That's part of the reason that we created a very accelerated timeline. Our objective was to get the district stood up as quickly as possible to allow for that additional planning to happen within the larger districts. It is really, I think, hard to do that within our current construct because our district lines are kind of creating these artificial boundaries that if we really expand those lines, we might think differently about how we would create those feeding patterns from elementary, middle, and high, and which schools may want to consolidate and how we involve communities in that process.
But I do think that it's worth saying again, because it has been a point of broad misunderstanding, that the governor's proposal never set minimum enrollment requirements, was not intended to close small schools. And in fact, the formula carried the existing portfolio of school buildings with additional weights, with the intention that over time, when small by necessity was defined, that those weights would only apply to schools that were determined to be small by necessity, but again, did not require school closure. I think it's worth saying again and again and again. It's been a broad point of misunderstanding, misperception in the public that I think has created a lot of unnecessary fear and anxiety. Yes.
Senator Hardy.
I was just hoping that we were gonna get to talking about the bill and what you would like specifics in the bill about what you would like to see different and where you have concerns, like on pages in sections of the bill. Because the governor's proposal is not on the table anymore. This is the proposal on the table, and it would be really helpful for us to be talking about this proposal and what concerns and changes you would like
This
to
is our
see.
first walkthrough. I think the secretary said that they would be back
Yes.
to go.
We just only have so much time.
I think it's also helpful to clarify so that as we're evaluating various proposals, we all have a base understanding of all of the various proposals.
Yeah.
And there isn't a shared understanding.
We will get to section by section with highlights, but probably not today, but early next week.
Yes, we will. And we are doing that deeper dive. This was kind of a recent request, I think, from yesterday, at least come in and begin the conversation. But I want to talk a little bit about how we're thinking about small by necessity, because it is an important component as we're giving feedback around the implementation timeline. As we contemplated small by necessity, it was not just for rural communities. It was also thinking about the physical plant of the school. And that in this transition period, we need to consider the cost effectiveness about building new things of that nature early on. And so there might be schools that even though they are in a more populated area, it doesn't, we might call them small by necessity because the school next door maybe doesn't have the capacity to host more students. And so those are practical considerations that we were building into the transition for small by necessity, which is why we always thought about school construction aid as a phased approach. So we really thought about focusing on making refinements to how we operate and deliver education within our existing infrastructure, and doing an evaluation within the districts around where, when, and how it would make sense to consolidate for then school construction aid to kick in. I think there's an assumption, and there's an assumption in the House's plan, that we would need to necessarily make building improvements in order to transition. And a lot of the transition we're contemplating is around operations. Facilities do play a role as we really think about right sizing in the future, but there's on our part was a real assumption that would take time, and that would take really leadership and oversight within the new districts. And I do think you're going to hear us provide feedback on timeline, and so I think that's an important assumption for you to understand with that. So areas where we are going to have further review, really diving deeper into the assumptions underlying the base funding, including efficiencies. It is important for us to think about what we're proposing related to scale and efficiency, and we have some questions around the assumptions underlying that foundation formula. We know also that it is more expensive in the short run, and could potentially cost even more should there be a reduction in federal funding. And we're also trying to understand in that base funding, what is explicitly defined in terms of educational opportunities. It's really based upon our existing system and existing spending, which I think we had always contemplated as a bridge to the foundation formula. I think what's different with the House is that there'd be really two foundation formulas that are contemplated in the proposal. The first would be the cost-based model that would come into effect in fiscal year 30. And then thereafter, there'd be another move to the evidence-based model once certain conditions are met. That is a much longer timeline. We certainly have concerns about the state's ability to carry those costs in the interim and the impact that could have on educational opportunities in the short run for students. So that's something we want to dive deeper in and understand as we're thinking about the transition. We also have questions around the assumptions for CTE, preschool, special education, and transportation. The proposal that does not conflict really well with preschool and specifics in that areas. Special education is recommending a shift in how we fund, which we've started to have exploratory conversations, moving from the census base to having the weights. And so we just need to understand the modeling of that a little bit better to provide more concrete feedback. We do have a lot of questions around the timeline, which I've mentioned. I think the main sticking point as we're thinking about refining the plan is the actual foundation formula itself in terms of the cost and what is assumed within that, and the timeline are the two major things. We have questions on the process for determining the larger districts. As I've shared, one of the key priority is trying to get these organized as soon as possible, right? To really support with that mission. The House bill does include a longer timeline for that. With the option for the commission to be part of the community input. We were really clear when we put forward the policy objectives, and I think it is paramount for us to really articulate those as in partnership to make sure that we can provide that feedback in really explicit ways. And there are choices that are made, right? So as we make adjustments to either district size or funding that might impact our ability to deliver on certain policy goals. And I think we just need to be explicit around those choices, knowing that there isn't an endless supply of dollars. And so as part of our proposal and moving forward, we'd like to start next week, is really identifying those shared goals so that we can help to evaluate the current bill in relation to that. So I've already kind of signaled out the timing of school construction. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So
on the timeline, I don't think anybody knows the answer to this, but if somebody's going to know best, it might be the Secretary of Education from Vermont regarding looking at the following year from the, I'm going to call it chaos out of Washington, D.C. and the possible closures of the Department of Education. How much does that looming uncertainty factor into what you see as some of the pressure points on our timeline?
Yeah, so we came forward with a really comprehensive proposal that we knew would be perceived as pretty bold and different than how we operate schools. And that was because the two reasons. One, I think the Senate had declared a state of emergency, right? And also we were concerned about the uncertainty of the federal context, and that created more of an urgency for us to think around how we can stabilize first our system and then future-proof it to these unpredictable swings. So we definitely feel a sense of urgency. I think this past year has been another really difficult budgeting year for our districts. They've cut significantly. And, are relieved that most of the budget passed this year, but that happened through some really painful cuts. And we continue to be faced with that option of, if we don't make these changes, the an option at other levels to continue to cut programs. And so the longer we have, the more concerned we are around how that can disadvantage our students in terms of opportunities. On the other hand, we realize that this change is really big, and it will require a lot of support as we move forward. And I think all would love the benefit of time, right? I think let's all acknowledge if we had more time, we'd love to take more time. I think our concern is managing the risk, given the current environment, and doing that as responsibly as possible.
I think we've also, I mean, the data that we presented in January shows really unequivocally that in our current funding system, we know that as a general statement, our less resource communities are spending less per student, and they're making up that gap with federal dollars. So what that tells us really clearly is that if there was a reduction in those federal dollars, we know that it will disproportionately hit our least resourced students. And so that is a real point of urgency. I understand there's been some sentiment like that because things are chaotic, we should go slower. I don't know what the answer is to those students. And I think we have to have an answer to those students if we're going to say we have to slow down. Because we know how we are currently funding. There is no question about it. The data is really clear. And if we already have about a $2,000 difference per student in terms of state funding that's made up with federal. So if that federal funding is reduced, we know what the impact currently is. And we also know that those communities are the ones that oftentimes struggle the most to pass budgets, and they do it with further reductions.
You say 200 million, you said that amount of money is
It's about our total federal dollars is about 140.
140. Thank you.
And it is by design, those
Yeah.
federal funds are directed towards the neediest students.
Okay.
I think to answer Hardy's question, and we're laying out, these are the areas where we're going to come back with specific feedback.
That would be great.
And then in terms of the approach moving forward and how we would propose to approach this is making sure we're really documenting and explicit on those shared goals. We're going to provide a recap of what ours are, and if we have different ones, we want to make sure that those being accounted for. We'll evaluate those options based on the shared goals using a rubric. There are certain components of that House bill that I think would warrant further engagement from subject matter experts, specifically special education. I think there's a lot of revision within that House bill. We were not part of testimony over the last several weeks, so I think that would be important to include in this, along with pre-kindergarten. Part of our plan is intended to expand pre-kindergarten. There hasn't been as much focus on that this session, so we want to carve out time and space for that, along with career technical education. There's been 2 years of study around that with concrete recommendations, and I think it's a really important point to make sure we can modernize that system this year. And then with that, we provide modeling based on these potential adjustments, understanding that any change to funding, governance, quality expectations are all connected. And then, of course, we really are very genuine in the intention to build consensus on this proposal. I think we all share an understanding the need for transformation and sharing the goals of expanding educational quality, equity, and sustainability for taxpayers. So we're in it to be engaged with doing this work. In terms of the rubric, just outlined some initial considerations as we think about those 3 principles. So with education quality, we had identified explicit goals to increase the average teacher salary. And when we describe this, it's really focused on achieving teacher pay parity across our state. We look to expand pre-kindergarten access, expand college and career readiness opportunities starting in middle school, increase equity of educational opportunities for students, and this includes ensuring that all students at every level has access to an array of applied arts, advanced coursework, electives, extracurriculars, and these are really important to the student experience that we're hearing directly from students themselves, and increase access to specialized resources, including mental health support, behavior management. So these are explicit goals that we have in our policy proposal. And they come with choices. And so as we go forward, there needs to be adjustments that may need to be a reprioritization. This is what we would propose for quality. And then for funding,
Yes, you want to increase average teacher salaries and pay parity. How about with administrators? Is there any desire to create a level playing field for administrators? And I'm particularly interested in schools that are private that receive a lot of public funding because they're 95% of their students are publicly tuitioned, as well as compared to public schools. Is there any desire to create a level playing field there?
so we had a really clear proposal that's not included in the House plan around really thinking about the relationship between independent schools and public schools. It's not plan for you.
And admin pay as well was in there?
We talked about shared accountability in terms of financial and academic outcomes. We didn't specifically talk about pay for administrators. We have talked about a statewide salary schedule, and that being important to achieve parity. Our focus in terms of making adjustments within the model was really focusing on teachers because that's where we saw there was the biggest discrepancy in pay. As we've done some initial modeling, of course, this is based on the 5-district model. We have to look at that as we would be able to, increase salaries in certain parts of the state by 12,000 on average per teacher to get to parity with our higher paying districts. So we could include in the model just parity around administrators. Our focus has been within public schools, but that's because our proposal was different as we thought about the relationship with different schools.
Maybe you want more jelly beans?
Any other questions? But I would just say, as we talk about quality, we are trying as an agency to make a intentional shift talking about outcomes, not as focused on inputs. And so I think that's a distinction, right? We're really trying to think about there are multiple pathways to get to high quality academic and financial outcomes, right? That are consistent and ensure high levels of accountability to public dollars. And conditions are important, but we're really trying to shift to the outcome-based results-oriented model.
Would you take a pause there? I think there's also some misunderstanding when we are talking about outcomes. I think there's a misunderstanding that we're talking about test scores.
Mhm.
And so if you want to speak a little bit more, this is a huge area of your background, what we're talking about when we're talking about student outcomes.
Yeah. It's very clear that Vermonters value a holistic measure of student success. And we reported that in our listen and learn report. We are contemplating that as we're building out our strategic plan and also updating indicators for our state level plan. So it is not just about academic indicators. We know academic indicators are important. We want to see our students achieving at high levels in literacy and math. We also want to see our students graduating at high levels, right? We've seen a reduction in our graduation rate. We know that there are other factors that are influencing a student's ability to thrive in school. One of those being chronic absenteeism. So we are focusing on developing strategies to reduce chronic absenteeism. We see higher rates of chronic absenteeism for our students who are unhoused and our students living in poverty. And so as we think about holistic measures of success, it is not just about test scores. It's really about understanding those conditions as well. And that being part of our explicit planning and goal setting as we think about that at the state level and then cascading that down to districts and to schools. And so we're being really intentional in that planning. We are in the process of updating our state level plan. And we're having a lot of conversations around those low child indicators that are going to be important to fully measuring success for students.
And this was part of our thinking when when we were looking at how we evaluate different proposals, how does it drive towards some of those holistic, outcomes for students as well? And how do we evaluate that?
Yeah,
think one of the concerning things for me is the number of our students who do not go on
Yes.
to any form.
Yeah.
Of post-high school training, education.
Graduation, persistence rates,
Yeah.
employment after, by all of our measures, we're not serving our students as well as we'd like to.
And so it's also about how we're preparing them for success
Yes.
after high school, and that gets into those college and career readiness indicators. We're working really closely with our higher education partners in the state as well to create greater alignment, so that we can really be supportive of creating pathways for students. Two other areas we think with this rubric is one looking at funding, really evaluating transparency, predictability, and sustainability. We know that the foundation formula does that, and I think that's really been the appeal, and why there's broad support for a foundation formula, because it can promote equity and it's really clear how the funding and fair as well. We understand, I think this was a conversation we walked into when we opened the door. We were talking about some of these financial cliffs, of what the difference going to be for districts. So part of, I think, our work over the next month is really to mitigate those fiscal cliffs to districts. And that's where that bridge funding is really important to contemplate. As we're transitioning our system and readying it for to be higher functioning, more efficient.
I think also just to that point, I think that there is work to be done over time to, as the secretary is saying, to prepare the system for thinking in a different way, right? So I think there's a real natural response to say, what does this mean for my district? And we have tried through, creating models for the proposed 5 districts. We could do the same for other district configurations that will help folks to start to think about, what does this look like as a different district system with a different approach to the way that we might think about staffing and sharing of resources. There is a mental bridge that needs to happen over time as well, from thinking about my district, my supervisory union, what does this mean for my numbers, versus what are the resources that I would have available in a larger system, so that I am not recreating whole cloth the same resources and duplicating effort across 52 SUs across the system. So that is, I think, some mental work that we all sort of collectively need to do. And I do mean the collective we, also in terms of the partners in the field.
Yeah, I had a question. So you mentioned bridge funding. What do you mean by that? Is that the $4 million that you requested, or is that something different?
The $4 million is to support with the transformation to increase the agency's capacity
Okay,
to provide in the field. We're talking about bridge. I think the House has articulated this as well. What we're describing in the evidence-based models as a future state is a different way to operate schools. And there needs to be a transition to that, so that we are able to mitigate those fiscal cliffs and prepare the system. Within the governor's proposal, there was a 2-year planning before we transitioned to the foundation formula, with the fiscal year 27 having a block grant, which would be based on current spending levels with adjustments. The House's plan is moving towards a version of an evidence-based model, and suggesting that we fiscal year 30, I think, move towards the cost-based foundation formula, which is based on existing spending.
Okay, so the
mechanism for the
block
bridge, I
grant
think, is the
was
question.
the bridge that in the original proposal, and you're looking at the cost-based formula as the bridge in the House's proposal. Is
Although
that-
it doesn't kick in for several
Yeah,
years. So what,
so I
one
mean,
of our questions is what happens?
Yeah, I think that's a question.
between now and then. So,
Yeah.
I mean, so that to Senator Chitten's question about, there's the chaos at the federal level, and I hear you about, some districts are going to be impacted more than others because some districts are more reliant on federal funding. And the level of change that we're contemplating with whatever proposal we go to is enormous, and to try to rush that during a time of instability, I think could be even more disastrous. And so I'm wondering if we think about a slower timeline so that we can make sure that we do it correctly, like a timeline more in line with what's in the House proposal, but also including some kind of bridge to stabilize the system right now. Because I know how much work it is to create a new school district. I've done it. It is an enormous amount of work, and this is even more work. And I hear you about needing to stabilize the school districts. I have several of them in my district that I'm very worried about. So, like, thinking about how can we do both, have a timeline that is humane and have the bridge funding to stabilize the system as we're doing that transition, I think is really important to think about.
That is the crux. I think that's exactly, it needs to be the focus. And I believe we all share that commitment to doing this well and doing it right. And we are trying to also manage risk in the short term as well. I think one of the considerations that we have is that districts are currently having to think about making really big changes now. And I think what we've heard a lot from districts is sometimes they have to do it on their own. It would be helpful to have that clarity around the state expectations of where we're headed and the guardrails to support that, because within our existing structure, it's often hard to make those changes. And I think we just need to balance those risks moving forward, and that'll be a big focus of our recommendations as we work with you.
We talked about this when I was in earlier this week, being able to tell the districts where we're heading as soon as possible, I think is a critical piece. Because as you said, they're doing facilities master plan, right? But they're doing it facing inward, right? What would it look like if they were doing it knowing what their districts might look like in 3 years, right? So being able to lay that foundation in the groundwork and the expectations for what class sizes will be, what district boundaries will be, what ed quality standards will be as soon as possible. And then have that bridge period.
Right, and I completely agree, but I think the proposal that we have on the table actually does tell them what we're doing and where we're going. And a lot of it is based on what they told the House committees that they need. And then, you know, this is a timeline that works for us, and this is a process that works for our school districts, and they know what to expect when. So if you're going to propose a shrunken timeline, you got it there. You need to do so in a way that, I think shrinking the timeline too much is going to be problematic, because we need to make sure we do the steps right, and the districts know what to expect each year, and hearing it from them is the important thing. And that's what I think the proposal was based on, is what they said, this works for us this timeline.
So I think we're hearing the governor's timeline. We've got the houses. And our job is going to be to evaluate both proposals and do what we think is best, which generally is something in the middle. But we will hear from the schools. We will hear. I know that Senate Ed is working on transition schedules. And we will work on one. We will come to agreement as to what it will look like. But today is
Setting the stage.
is day for the administration to tell us what their concerns are. We're going to hear from the schools and what their concerns are. We've heard from the House and what their solutions were. And we will see where we end up at the end of that, and we will start developing solutions that hopefully the Senate is set up to be a little more broad-based and conservative, find out.
We can also share the work that we did with policy sprint teams. To Senator Hardy's point, we worked with a group of superintendents, business managers, special ed directors, school board members to get their feedback. And we have all that information as informing our supports, and we're happy to share that as well. I know you'll hear from members of the field as well, but we also did that work.
Okay, and maybe we will find out some of the people you've talked to, and some of the other people, and see if my favorite thing is go to the hall and talk it out.
Yeah.
Because we're going to fix something and you'll like what you come up with better than what we do. So it might be a good time to start putting people in a room and seeing if they can come up with a solution. We will have to develop the goals. We've got several here for them to come up with. But yes, states are not coming up with $100 billion a year to buy down tax rates, and that's what it's costing us. And that's money we don't have to go in to a lot of other programs or to keep programs we have afloat. What I think we're all expecting will be federal cuts.
Yeah. Definitely. Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Cummings and I in the morning are trying to save our healthcare system. And we are definitely focusing on a long range plan that has dates and times and rollouts. And then we have an emergency plan for now. Instead of rushing that long-term plan and trying to condense it into like an immediate thing, we're doing it right. And I think I've sort of been hearing like little threads of that theme. It's like, if we have an emergency now, what can we do in the short term? But then what's our long-term plan? And so instead of rushing, and my only other point was just, if the governor has a plan, which apparently he does, and if he wants to work with us on this one, I would suggest he go out and talk to the people of Vermont. And you as well. And the Listen and Learn tour was great, but that was before all of this was proposed. I'm taking the heat every single week in my district. And the governor, I think he came to my district once that I can think of when the UVM soccer team won the championship. Really nice gesture, super cool. He should be coming on a regular basis to talk to the people about what this plan is going to mean. You know, as well as I do, education is extremely emotional, right? And we're all experts because we all went to school. So if he wants this kind of like collaboration, he needs to get out into the field and talk to Vermonters. We can't do it ourselves.
We just echoed this morning's
Oh,
group
okay,
meeting.
great. I didn't know. Who knew?
Great minds are all running in the same direction. But I think we made it clear that we need some help.
Yeah.
We need the bully pulpit out there reminding people what it was like a year ago. And how bad it was even when we came up with $100 billion to buy down the pain. It's going to be painful. I think what we heard this morning is we are going to see a 5% increase in insurance. We're probably looking at another major increase just to maintain stability, and we are doing everything humanly possible to get the cost down. But this again is a national one. Just read 2 more hospitals in Pennsylvania declared bankruptcy. And so, yeah, the healthcare system is in the morning, but it is in as much crisis as the education system. And we're going to fix the education system this afternoon.
And the governor has started, to be presenting on all of these priorities and giving an update on where we are in Southern Vermont recently. So, he's really committed to transform the education system and get to the positive result. At the agency, we're in ongoing conversations, and you're right, they are challenging and difficult conversations. And it's important that we're listening and we're really being thoughtful around, you know, not making change for change's sake, but ensuring that there's making improvements and then strengthening our public education system to help our students and support our educators. So we are all engaged in those conversations. I agree, it was real.
So the House's plan has the foundation formula, the foundation form amount tied closely to the governance, and I see the rationale. I'm hearing from Smart School following this issue closely this week that there might be an alternate track where we separate those two timelines, where maybe a foundation formula will come into place on a sooner timeline while the governance continues on the track that's outlined. I know these are fast evolving conversations. Do you have any reactions to that notion? Or what are your first set of questions that you'd ask if that type of thing would occur?
I struggle with that. Because I think the foundation formula is tied to the government. It doesn't mean that it has to be by district, right? I think there's different configurations, but the assumptions in a foundation formula are built on certain expectations around educational delivery and educational quality. I think it's hard to separate that and ensure that we're getting the outcomes we desire.
I think it's so critical to take, I know everyone's moving really quickly, but to take the time to identify what your goals and priorities are as you're evaluating different proposals. Right, so we've always said there's a three-legged stool here of funding, governance, and quality. And we have asked folks to sit with that complexity, which is not great when we're trying to move quickly in legislative session. But if you start pulling one lever, it has implications for the other two. And if you're not really, really clear about what your priorities are, it can be really challenging to evaluate the impact on something like quality and delivery of educational services if you're pulling one lever, but you haven't really identified what you're aiming for with the other levers. So I do think it's, sometimes Secretary Saunders says we have to move slow to move fast. And so I think that there's a moment here. You now have this bill. You have that original 196 pages of the original bill. There's other ideas that are floating around, but we have a rubric that is based, and Secretary just shared kind of the key factors there by which we are evaluating, and please, you know, engage with us on that. And if you have other priorities that need to be included, let's articulate those. And I think there's a real strength in being really transparent, right? Because we're not all going to agree. That's just not going to happen. But if we're all transparent about what our different priorities are, then at least we can say to Vermonters, this is the plan we came up with based on these priorities, and this is how we evaluated it. So I do think we've heard that as well. I think it's really critical to just stop and say, what are our goals?
And I also, I think part of the goal of the thing is important to articulate is a sense of urgency, right? I think that's what we're all hearing.
Yes.
You know? So with all of these considerations, it's about risk management, right? And so we want to be read in on the different considerations so we can kind of evaluate what would that look like, right? If that were done separately. And I think it's really important to be concrete so that we're understanding the impact and then helping to manage around the risk and managing around the disruption to the field. So whichever scenario we go, I just want everyone to have assurance that, you know, the Agency of Education is really committed to being supportive of this work, and we're really thinking about the risk management piece of it and implementation.
Just wrapping up the comment to that really quick, I hear us in a lot of agreement. We seem to all see the desired possible future state, for lack of a better term. What we're really struggling with is the timeline. I love Gantt charts, and I feel like so that we're all talking about the same thing. I don't have enough time in the day to really do it right. That I don't know if the administration can do it or JFO, but I really think this is going to get us all talking about the same things, to really lay out the timelines in the House bill and the timeline that the administration would like to see, because that's where I think the discussion will be better for us out there.
Isn't there one? We have one on our website, a timeline.
there's a time.
I'd like to see it in the Gantt format, expanded, yeah. Line up.
Yes,
Very common tool, but helps you understand
but I-
how it's overlap.
it would help to get the two town. We have,
And see where
Yeah.
there's slack, where can we
Yeah.
make some adjustments, right? I think that's where we are right now, because you're right, we're really starting from a place of like, we know all of these things need to happen in concert.
Right.
In order to be responsible and transforming our system for the better. And we, work through these details.
and I think the thing to remember is that in the present situation, that cost leg of the stool is what's being pulled. Because that's the only thing the schools really have, and there are decisions being made that are not advantageous.
Yeah, that's driving the quality.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, that's our concerns as well.
so it isn't a static situation. Things are changing by necessity and will continue until we can show a bridge forward, and they will hit the smaller, more disadvantaged schools first. If the federal cuts come through, there will be a major crisis, and we will deal with it. But we'll find out which one of us has the personality to survive in turbulent times. Because it is turbulent enough right now, and the potential is it's going to get worse before it gets better. So that
Have you guys thought about what happens if there is no governance reform? Have you thought about that scenario?
I think the quality piece is really challenging. I think we're sort of forgetting that the barriers to educational quality are system barriers, right? And so the kinds of things that I think the state has articulated really clearly and we have heard really clearly, things like opportunities, things like consistency, high quality instruction and specialization of services within districts. There are system barriers because of the size and complexity of our system.
And I think in the governance conversation, I think that's the most likely outcome.
That's unfortunate.
I don't
think that's
disagree.
necessary.
I don't disagree. Just my opinion, that's the most likely outcome right now.
I think that we should be talking about choices and cost, right? I mean, like cost to students when we're having those conversations.
I think
Cost
that
to students should be the center of it.
I think we need to, for all these decisions, demonstrate the impact. And so what would this look like without governance? So what that means is implementing a federal system, knowing that we're not operating at scale, and knowing that schools and districts won't be able to offer this educational programs. How do we mitigate that impact on educational quality? Right? I think all of this just needs to be continually going back and centering this work around what we're hoping to achieve for students. And understanding how we can manage around those risks and what the cost of that is as well. I did want to follow up too on I think Senator Bullock, you had mentioned around kind of emergency planning as you're talking about in the other committee. I do think there's an important aspect of this of triage. And part of what we put forward in the budget request for $4 million was to increase our capacity to really do that is really triaging and doing some early identification around districts and schools that need more off the ground and targeted support. So I think there's a benefit in us bringing that back into this conversation and really articulating what that approach looks like and how we're planning to differentiate our support. Knowing that there's some early actions and changes that need to happen in order to stabilize.
That may be the most important part of municipal conservation management and everything else.
I was just gonna say that I think that, I mean, I hear you, Senator Beck, about that your skepticism about the creation of districts. It's a fraught area for sure, but I don't think we should pass a bill right now that assumes it's not going to happen. I think that if that's part of what we think collectively is important as governance change, then we should try to set up a process that would lead us to governance change if we think that's important. And I think the bill tries to do that. And
There's a fiscal time bomb there too.
I think the timeline, this is our challenge. I mean, it is, we are starting to place the shared understanding of all these pieces need to come together. And the real challenge is getting the balance right with the timeline.
So on this very point, and I'm not getting on a soapbox here, but I do want to empower the voters, and that's where I know that we're all contemplating election of school boards for these new districts. I didn't go so far as to have them vote on the districts themselves, and in each of those communities. That I'm ready to have the voters, and I feel like when that's timed out for March of 2027, when the financial time bomb blows up or otherwise, when we have more information. I trust Vermonters to make the right decision, and don't want to put this in their hands, that maybe we should ask them to, if they want to join that school district. I'm ready to contemplate how that could look.
As
in my
long as-
county, that would be super hard. I can just tell you.
It's the most divisive part of the process, right?
Yes, but I think the idea is that you're only gonna get the foundation plus weights. And you're going to have to manage your school. And if we come through with quality standards, you are going to have to manage your school to those quality standards, because
We
it's,
have
No,
quality standards right now.
but,
Influence.
okay, but if we start enforcing them to the level we should, the schools are going to be under a great deal of pressure, because they are not going to be able to eliminate, math courses and literature courses or art class, because they don't have the money. And I think it's anticipated, because they don't have the ability to go to their own voters and say, we need to raise X $1,000 so we can have an art teacher in every school in the district. That's going to be a very heavy pressure into finding a way to consolidate, which we don't have now, because the voters will say, well, of course my kids should have art and should have language in middle school. But because of our structure, we've lost that direct cost to you. And in this, depending on what we do above base spending, if we allow you to spend any more, it will be a direct hit to your individual tax rate. And I think that will have some inclination for behavioral change, but maybe not in the timeline that we need it to. But that will be a pressure there.
Chair, what's our timeline? How much time do we have together now?
This
So-
is it.
Are we done now? Or do we have a little more time, or?
We got jelly beans.
I'm enjoying this conversation, actually. But,
We have as much time as
Oh.
the secretary has to give us.
so I do want, I am curious about the ticking time bomb, Senator. I want to hear more about that.
We'll buy down this year, and we'll have to be next year, but
Yeah.
Okay, all right, so
But
that,
not against the delegates.
but until we get the insurance rates down, I don't, anyway,
That's
that's,
even worse.
Wait, what are you saying that, what is specifically you're saying?
Health insurance rates.
I mean, the difference between inflation and what the schools are growing at is there's a delta there. And that's effectively what we're buying down, is that delta every year. And next year we have to buy down next year's delta, and we have to buy down this year's delta, and it just grows and grows and grows. And the healthcare situation makes it even worse.
well, really drives a lot of it. I guess my question is, because I do really appreciate you taking the time to delve into some of this. The healthcare crisis is its own thing. I mean, that is a real crisis when we're about to lose our only insurer, like that is real. The education crisis, if we're calling it that, I would like to hear more because we just had a vote and most budgets across the state, vast majority of them did pass. We're already seeing sort of like organic, things happening. I know in my district, the school has closed, Summit School's closed, and those elementary kids are gonna go to a different school. That's becoming a special needs school within their district, so they're kind of creating their own therapeutic school within the district, which I think is great. I know Senator Hardy had an elementary school closed. They're gonna be going 10 minutes down the road to another school that can take them in. I know North Hero School just closed. So I mean, there are a lot of things happening organically that I actually think are gonna help with what we are kind of hoping to do anyway. So that's my question is like, if we're gonna, like, is it really a crisis? I know it's not a perfect system by any means, but it's trucking along. Kids are generally safe, kids are fed, kids are learning. Our folks are employed, you know, again, I just wonder if it really is a crisis. It needs changing, it needs reform.
Just remember
I know.
those budgets passed this year with the guarantee from the governor that he would buy down your tax
Well, we
rate.
don't know that, we don't know what was in the
Well, I
mind of the
don't,
voter
but
when they went.
I wonder what if people would have absorbed an additional 5% if they thought they were actually.
You know that
going
the
to
governor
absorb.
doesn't have the power of the purse.
No, and we may not be able to deliver on that. But that was the promise that was out there in March. And it was well publicized, so, I'm enough of a sociologist to say it had some impact. I won't say it had a 50% or an 80%, but I'm sure it had some impact.
I just wanna, words matter, as we say a lot in here, and I just wanna make sure the words that we're using are appropriate for the situation.
So I said crisis in the Senate, President indicated that we had education crisis. And invited the administration to put forward a plan. And that's the challenge.
Yeah, that's what I'm not, I mean, that's, again, it's not me.
He doesn't speak for all.
Yeah, I'm not the
Right.
pro lead,
So I think there's that, I think there's, we heard really clearly, from Vermonters that the system is becoming unaffordable, and there's a sustainability challenge. When we approached this work, and certainly from the education, good education, it was around educational quality, because we know that there's, because many of our schools are not able to be as well resourced, they can't offer the variety of programs and opportunities. And that has to do with funding and scale,
saying
right?
we don't need reform. That's not what I said. I'm asking if it's a crisis.
Yeah.
Sorry. go ahead.
I want to agree with you. I do think that in my 5 years of doing this, we use crisis too easily. So, and I don't necessarily see this as a crisis, but I do see us on an unsustainable track. And what I like the term time bomb, this is what I think is likely to happen this coming spring. And I don't have a crystal ball, but we are buying down the tax rate with $77 million from the general fund. That we might very likely won't have next year. I do predict a recession. I do predict less revenues to come in. That's from excess revenues that we budgeted for. And that spending increase this year is going to amplify again. So the shortfall I see is the 77 million plus whatever shortfalls there are from the feds. And so I'm expecting us to be back here in January with a terrible December 1 letter, having to come up with more than $100 million just to get rates in the single digits. And that's my concern. And so that's the ticking time bomb I'm anticipating to give me a sense of urgency on this, but I wouldn't use the word crisis.
Well, can I add on to that? I agree. I don't like to use the word ticking time bomb because that
Sure.
freaks me out. But, and I think that you made a good argument for why we may want to consider not using the 77 million all this year and save some for next year to help alleviate the pressures that we're going to see next year. And I do think we have to be careful about how we use the term crisis, because we've sort of ramped everything up into a crisis. But I would say that in my district, there are schools that are really struggling. And there are schools that are doing great and fine. And so it really depends on where you are and what the appetite for voters are in that district, but also the supports and the type of student population that a district has. So I think there's a sense of urgency in some communities more than in other communities. So maybe it's that sense of urgency. And I think it's the perfect time for all of us to be talking about reform. And what I think is important is that we talk about, where we all do agree. And there are a lot of things in this bill that are very similar to what was in your bill. And trying to build off of what's in here and make tweaks to it so that we can all live with it, I think is a really good way to move forward, rather than trying to come up with something completely different or to go backwards to something else. There is a lot of really great work that's gone into this, and I feel like we can make some changes once we hear the specifics. But like sending everybody out into the hall, I don't think is a productive way of managing it. We need to be working on.
But with the voice of experience, I chaired Act 46. I tried to learn from my mistakes. We didn't go far enough. We knew then the Secretary of Education went around to almost every school district in this state to show them their numbers. And if you're in a larger school district, in a larger population area, you're not seeing it. It has filtered down now into what were my more affluent schools. Berry City has always been there. We knew that the present structure was not financially viable over 10 years ago. We have lost 40,000 students in our schools. And there's no influx of climate immigrants or anything else that is coming in here in the near future to save us. Now, we don't have the houses to put them in. If we don't go far enough, we will create another Act 46 issue where we will do just enough to fail, and then to leave everybody who thinks that we just can print money, or there's enough money up there somewhere in those 100 rich people we have that will bail us out. If we're going to do this, we need to do it once and for all, because we've already blown one chance and it's gotten worse. And there's no reason to think, given Washington, it could tank rather rapidly. And we are going, whatever we do, we're going to have to do enough to make a significant difference, or we're still playing catch up with COVID, with the kids that missed basic math and reading, kindergarten and first grade. If we tank this time, we're going to lose a whole generation of kids who were not prepared to survive socially, economically, in a world that's much wider than our small towns. The days when you could just get out and go to work in the forest or on the farm are over. I mean, you can do it, you just won't make enough money to live on. And so we need to do something, and something significant. It hasn't gone away. It hasn't gotten back.
We should stop offering public school, go back to the farming.
Well, somebody said we could just declare everyone at the homeschool, and that would solve the problem.
I can't teach.
No, dark humor gets to be.
The Matrix.
But
By
we,
third grade, I
And it's Friday afternoon, it's Good Friday, and everybody wants to go.
I know.
home and ready to start.
did a terrible job of being on.
I know, it's not-
She was supposed to take it out.
Oh, and Jason did, so you had to show up.
But we commit to being constructive in this conversation, right? I think we understand there is a sense of urgency, and it's not just around financial, it's around opportunities for our students. And so, today was just to really kind of set the table, really focus on areas where I think we have consensus, highlight, specific points where we need to review further so we can be more constructive with offering our feedback. And we'll be doing a deeper dive into the foundation formula and coming back also with specific recommendations around components of the bill. So we
We're
commit to-
going to be chunking the bill out.
If we could know that schedule, that would be
Okay.
helpful for us.
I will let you know
Okay.
as soon as I know what it is. We're also trying to finish up some bills we've gotten here.
Okay. That would help us stage our review.
To get out, I've got one or two of those, but we're good, and we're balancing staff with Senate Ed. Unfortunately, it's a challenge enough with the House, but we're both afternoon committees. And I've already been told we book the lawyers every day next week, and that's not acceptable. So we're going to be working at scheduling. We will do one afternoon on reappraisals so that they can have John and we get Kirby. But
Senator, can I say,
we're just getting into this, and we will make sure that
Yeah.
you get our schedule.
That'd be helpful.
and I appreciate your. When we submitted the governor's proposal, I mean, I don't know how else we could have said it, as we said it so many times. We really did mean we want to collaborate and refine it and make it better, right? And we still intend to do so. And so what are the opportunities to sit down and refine and tweak and improve and call out areas where I think we all in this room share a concern about how do we hang on to get to this future state and at what cost to the students that are currently in the system, right? And I do understand the note of caution of trying to move the system quickly is a big concerning and scary prospect. But particularly at the state level, we have a responsibility to every student in the system. And so we don't look at it from district to district or voting district to district. We look at all of the students, and we're concerned.
Yeah.
We're losing ground for a lot of students in particular communities, and it's not fair.
Yeah.
And we believe in equity in this state,
When
right?
we did Act 60, we took a tour. Now, we looked at some of the schools that had no tax base and saw schools. And I have a feeling some of those schools initially were able to spend more. And you have the nurse behind it. But I'm not sure now they even have a nurse. And it might be helpful for us to take a tour of some of the schools that we're talking about. Maybe we'll try and set that up. So that we see what is out there and what are they able to offer. Because, I can look around at my schools and even the ones that were built in 18 something down the street are in decent shape. And they've got a nice playground and, we've got ball fields and we're in a floodplain, but as long as it doesn't flood, we're good. But there are schools that don't have that. And there are schools that are too small to offer any kind of sports or to offer art and have no art. And Yeah.
There's problems out there.
We voted something.
Well, it's the amendment.
It's your amendment.
Because they know we're in here solving all the problems and they don't have to worry about
Who is?
the people out in the hall making all the noise.
No, they're just looking for money.
Well, we have to recognize that whatever we have here, we have something, whether we call it an emergency or not, it's something that has to be done with, has to be dealt with and solved with a degree of urgency. And with time, as one of the drivers that we always have to consider, it's always great to say, you know, well, we need to study this a little bit more, to get a little more input. And so we've been doing that for 20 years. That's why we have the 39 studies in the study warehouse over there. We have to make some decisions, and they're hard decisions, but we do. And we have to make some of them before we go home this year, or we shouldn't go home. And kicking things down to other study committees, we've been doing that for years and years and avoiding making decisions that are hard. We may not be right in what we ultimately do, but we have to do something. We can't continue to wait because this is not getting better. It's continuing to get worse every single year. The enrollment in our schools is going down. Our student performance, at least in standardized tests, is going down, and our costs are going up.
Only 50% of our kids go.
And how do we build in cycles of evaluation, right? So to your point, Senator, we don't want to do it wrong, but we can build in, it's a continuous improvement mindset, right? So you do, then you study, you evaluate, you adjust. That should all be built in here, right?
We'll need to
And
build
I
in.
think it is. I mean, I think those pieces,
Yeah.
in either version of the bill, those pieces are in there. But I appreciate the comment about making some choices.
Let's also just be realistic. Education in the state of Vermont is not going to be cheap. It's just not. We don't have the.
I don't think any of
scale.
us are proposing that it's cheap.
But people want it to be, and it's just not going to be.
And we want it to be less expensive than it is now, and is likely to be if we continue down the road we're going.
Well,
Without change.
I agree a lot with both of what I'm hearing. And what I also want to say is whatever we do, it's not going to end this conversation. We're going to continue to talk about how to educate our kids and how to pay for it for hopefully another 200 years or more. So this is just what
I
we're
mean,
here
it's a
for.
state that cares about education, which is, it's not a bad problem to have. It's a hard problem to have, but I've taught in districts where they did not care about public education, and it is not a problem that we have in Vermont. And so I think we have to honor that, right? We have to actually honor that commitment in the state.
We do not write off some of our kids, groups of our kids, as who cares if they get educated. And there are places that do that. But if we don't make sure that we are providing the best quality education, we are already seeing a significant movement by parents of their kids out of the public system and into a private system because they think they're going to get a better education. And in many instances, they're probably right. And as we get forced financially to cut, you're going to see more and more kids get let off that way. And we will end up with a system where the parents of the best and the brightest really don't have a vested interest in the schools. And we've got a chance to bring our schools up so that they are the places we want them to be for every kid and not, we need to bring them up, and people aren't still committed to doing that.
I actually think that's probably the biggest point of shared consensus that exists across the board is that every proposal, every idea that has been put forth is intended to strengthen the public education system. In other states, when faced with this kind of crisis, people create voucher systems. That's what they do. That's what other states have done. Here's your check. You take it, you go where you want to go. Nobody is contemplating that. And I think that is actually a huge victory for Vermont. There is no proposal on the table that contemplates any kind of voucher or write off of the public education system. In fact, everyone is doubling down and saying, how do we improve
No,
it?
but there are private schools that take public dollars and actually drain kids out of the public system, thus causing issues of scale and capacity. I mean, that's what's happening. If people want to spend their own money on private education, that's fine. That's their prerogative.
Whether, that wasn't my point there.
So the point is the proposal that the governor put forward was around strengthening public education.
In every proposal.
And subsequent proposals are also focused on strengthening public education. That is more challenging to do, but it is the absolute right work. And that's where I think we need to center our efforts. All the proposals that are coming forward acknowledge that it is expensive to deliver education in Vermont. But what we're trying to do is to make sure that those dollars are maximized and are really supporting expansive and well-rounded education for every child in the state. And there are ways that we can be smarter around how we're investing those dollars to achieve the priorities that we've outlined. And we'll create a system that is more sustainable, a place where teachers want to work, the place where parents want to locate, where businesses want to come, because we see education as a driver and essential part of our overall culture and economy in Vermont.
Okay.
That's our inspirational words at the end of a long week.
Can I brag to you too? My grandson made the governor's institute on engineering.
Oh, how exciting. That is very cool. Zoe and I got to attend our first track meet together with our kiddos
In the snow.
Floating
Delightful. Doing softball, sitting in the snow.
Yeah, the kids were all in shorts, like getting frostbite. It was very springy.
Yes.
The day before was a beautiful day, but the
Yeah.
RFG was
No,
not.
on Saturday.
Both did great. Yeah.
My grandson did track. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. We being back more and commit to being a constructive partner.
We will get there to that. Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
Let me go up here, but I was hoping to ask.
Thank you for the jelly beans.
Yeah.